Dublin, Easter 1916.
The rising was bungled terribly, costing many a good life. It had an air of a Greek tragedy. It seemed at first to be well organised, but became subjected to panic decisions and a great lack of essential organisation.
This is the story of why the guns remained silent in rebel Cork.
Cork City was an integral part of the British Empire, and it had a long military tradition. Not only Cork people joining the British Army, if you like, and being strongly associated with the Empire, but also British forces coming into Cork and being stationed in Cork. For example, James Connolly, leader of the Rising in 1916, his first time in Irish soil was as a young British soldier when he was stationed in Cork itself. Towards the end of the 19th century, you have a sort of a backlash against that to some extent. The Irish revival begins, the Gaelic League is founded, the Gaelic Athletic Association. You have a whole range of groups like the Cork Dramatic Society, for example. And so plays that were written specifically for the Cork Dramatic Society, such as Corkery's The Onus of Ownership, Terence MacSweeney's The Wooing of Emer, which was based on old Gaelic sagas relating to the glorious past, if you like.
In April 1912, the leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party, John Redmond, successfully introduced the Third Home Rule Bill. This development was met with fierce opposition from the Ulster Unionists.
And in September 1912, over 250,000 Unionists gathered in Belfast City Hall to sign the Solemn League and Covenant, pledging to resist the introduction of Home Rule. This was followed the following January by the formation of the Ulster Volunteer Force.
The Ulster Volunteers were, as Carson said, an army to defend Ulster against Home Rule. And this was, without doubt, the first step on the road to the militarisation of Irish society. The Irish Volunteers was a direct response to the formation of the Ulster Volunteers, but it was also the brainchild of a select group within the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And these people had been convinced of the view that the Third Home Rule Bill wouldn't give them a republic, it wouldn't give them independence, it was only going to give them something resembling county council status within the British Empire.
On the 14th of December 1913, Cork City Hall was packed to capacity for the inaugural meeting of the Cork Corps of the Irish Volunteers.
The sort of competing elements within Cork politics had all turned up, which was to lead almost inevitably to trouble. The Ancient Order of Hibernians, or the Molly Maguires, who were sort of the shock troops really of the Irish Parliamentary Party, had positioned themselves, a group of them, right up the front near the platform, and they were really looking for trouble because Redmond at this stage had not endorsed or embraced the volunteers, and it was seen maybe as a threat, a challenge to the authority of the Irish Parliamentary Party, the home rulers, if you like, of nationalist politics. The main speakers were Owen MacNeill, who was head of the Irish Volunteers, of course, founder of the Gaelic League, and Sir Roger Casement.
And when MacNeill finished his speech by calling for 3 cheers for the Ulster Volunteers, all hell broke loose in the hall.
Men wild and angry jumped up waving sticks. There was a cry of charge and a howling crowd of angry.
The platform became like a congested boxing ring. One fellow grabbed the water bottles, but he was struck under the chin and sent sprawling across the stage.
One protester lifted a chair and crashed it down on the chairman's head.
There was a monumental row between many of the different groups who were gathered in the hall, and it was only when somebody had the common sense to turn off the lights that order was regained. But nevertheless, a volunteer unit was established, an executive committee was formed, and the evolution of the Cork Brigade of Volunteers started that particular night in City Hall.
Military experience was needed, so retired British Army officer Captain Talbot Crosby was appointed commanding officer of the Cork Volunteers.
So the Irish Volunteers, indeed, certainly in the early months and in its early manifestation, was a very open, participatory, democratic organisation. Officers were elected and so on. It was very much a citizens' militia. It was also very much a kind of a DIY army in that sense that people had to buy their own uniforms, for example. Tailors, you know, were kept very busy, and dressmakers and so on. People had to acquire their own weapons if they could. There were even raffles where you could win a gun, you could win a uniform, that type of thing. They carried whatever weapon they could get. Sometimes that consisted of a hurley, sometimes pikes were used later on. So it was very much a kind of a recreational element to it almost, but a very strong sense of political purpose as well.
The critical difference between the Irish Volunteers and the Ulster Volunteers was that in Ulster, the political establishment was fully behind the Ulster Volunteer movement, whereas in the South, the political establishment most certainly was not. John Redmond and the Irish Parliamentary Party looked at the volunteer movement with deep suspicion.
As new recruits began to pour into the organisation, Redmond felt the time had now come for him to take control. Owen MacNeill also had similar thoughts.
And eventually it was agreed that Redmond would supply 25 members to the national executive of the Volunteers and 5 members to the Cork Committee.
The storm clouds of World War I were gathering over Europe. The unity of the Cork Brigade would soon be tested.
So immediately following the outbreak of war, Talbot Crosby, off his own bat really, offered the services of the Cork Volunteers to the British Army in the First World War.
Matters came to a head on Sunday, the 30th of August 1914, when a public meeting of the Cork City Corps of Volunteers was held in the Corn Market to decide the unit's future. After a long and acrimonious debate, over 1,000 men voted to follow Talbot Crosby.
Tomás McCurtain took command of the 26 volunteers who didn't follow Talbot Crosby.
The hardcore minority who resisted maintained the title Irish Volunteers. The Redmondites became the National Volunteers. So the volunteer movement that had been united across the summer of 1914 finally splits apart then in September 1914.
Over 6,000 Cork men answered the call and enlisted to fight for king and country. Britain highlighted local events in an intensified recruitment drive.
2 key events that were used in Cork, the Lusitania, the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, which was a massive sort of worldwide event and used generally, but it was specifically targeted at Ireland and at Cork as well, and Cork had a direct connection with it because the bodies were brought into Cove. There were also individuals associated with Cork who were directly used, most prominently Michael O'Leary from Inchigeela, who was the first Irishman to win a Victoria Cross or a VC medal in 1915.
Of course, at this particular time, it wasn't just those who took Redmond's advice who joined the ranks of the British Army.
You had young people who went just for adventure, young teenagers who forged their ages and got in. People like Tom Barry, who went on to lead the famous Flying Column, of course, in West Cork in the War of Independence. Tom Barry was a soldier in the British Army posted out to what is now Iraq and Mesopotamia at the time.
Over 2,000 Cork men were lost in action. Private Dick Lynch told of the horrors of trench warfare in his final letter home to his fiancée, Amy O'Shea.
My own darling Amy, at last I'm able to...
My darling Amy, over 60 dead since I wrote you last. It's a case of shells all day, and the gas is the knockout blow. I've seen the beautiful cathedral of Ypres knocked to pieces in less than an hour. It's as big as any 5 churches in Cork. By the way, if you have any numbers of the Examiner, I'd love to see them. Say an odd prayer, as accidents may occur to a fella at any time. But thank heaven I have a clean sheet.
Love to all your own and never always Dick.
Ireland at this stage was a massively militarised society. Fianna Éireann, the Republican Youth Organisation, for example, their citizen army founded in early 1913 as part of growing out of the Dublin lockout. The Ulster Volunteers then, and then the 2 volunteer forces, National Volunteers, Irish Volunteers, the Ancient Order of Hibernians. Some of them became armed in the Hibernian Rifles, Common Amon, the Women's Auxiliary to the Irish Volunteers. So right across the board then you have up to 250,000 people in these citizens' militias across the country. Added to that then you have an armed police force, the Royal Irish Constabulary, and you have the regular British Army.
All of these people were armed to one extent or another. All were training, all were mobilising, and all were following different political agendas. It was an extremely mobilised environment at that particular time.
I suppose that every organisation has landmarks, and one of the big ones for the Irish Volunteers would have been O'Donovan Ross's funeral. They were going to pay their respects to a Fenian, one of their brothers in the IRB, and whilst it was a sad occasion, there was a great sense of pride and achievement among the volunteers. They came from all over Ireland, and of course my grandfather led the volunteers up from Cork.
And this was, I suppose, the first time that units of the volunteers, the Irish volunteers, all came together in a public demonstration of military force. The Cork Brigade travelled by train to Kingsbridge Station and then marched from there to Glasnevin Cemetery to hear Pearse deliver the oration, which was chilling, and it resonated throughout the entire gathering when he said, "They think they have pacified us, they think they have solved everything, but the fools, the fools, the fools, they have left us, our Fenian dead." And it really had impact for those who listened to it and for those who went home to tell the story of what had happened on that day.
The Cork volunteers under McCurtain grew in strength. In Dublin, radical plans for the future of the volunteer movement were in progress.
So, as we move into 1916, we have in effect the beginning of a confused situation. You have the military council of the IRB, who are also volunteers, planning an insurrection, and there's no question about that. They are actively denying that to Owen MacNeill, who is the Chief of Staff of the Irish Volunteer Organisation. Now, in Cork, you have a situation where McCurtain, who's the brigade commander, is also in the IRB, but he's not in the same elite group as the military council. And his people on the ground are in the business of organising, training and trying to regenerate the brigade.
My granduncle John Kent initiated the volunteer movement in Fermoy and Castlelyons and all that area, and with Tom Clark and Terence McSweeney, who would come on board at the time, they wanted to look for people, young people especially, to become members of the volunteers. And to that purpose they met the Kent brothers from Barnard.
The two people who are most important are Terence McSweeney and Thomas Kent. They were the organisers and the trainers of the Cork Brigade of Volunteers. And in January of 1916, both of these were arrested and imprisoned for making a seditious speech at Ballyknoe village.
Patrick's Day, just a few weeks before the Rising, you had the volunteers in Cork walking in uniform in the Patrick's Day parade. They were equipped, they were well turned out, and they were now a well-trained body of men.
National volunteers also attended that Cork March, of course, much depleted in numbers because most of their numbers had gone off to join the British Army and fight in the First World War. And to signify that, they had a number of boys holding roped off area to signify those that were gone, and they actually had a sign suggesting that this was the space where their comrades who were fighting for Ireland in the trenches, and that's where they would have been. And that was also a sort of comment on the Irish volunteers, and very much a part of that mentality that the Irish volunteers were slackers.
On the 3rd of April, Patrick Pearse issued orders for Easter manoeuvres. 6 days later, Roger Casement set sail from Germany with a shipment of arms.
There was never any plan to take over Cork City. The plan involved going to Macroom, occupying the high ground between Macroom and Mill Street, blocking the pass of Caymanee, and then establishing a cordon line from there all the way to the Limerick border, behind which the arms could be landed securely in Kerry. That's what McCurtain was planning for on the 9th of April 1916.
On the Monday before Easter, Bridget Foley, a member of the Cumann na mBan in Dublin, arrived in the city with a dispatch from Sean McDermott, which informed McCurtain of the true objectives of the operation that would take place on Easter Sunday.
In fact, this message was actually an order converting the manoeuvres at Easter into an insurrection, and to put it mildly, McCurtain was outraged. This was the first he had heard from any source that a rising was being planned. He had not been part of the military council's planning, and he had genuine concerns for the capability of his unit if this was what he was required to do.
2 days later, Sean McDermott sent confirmation of the orders to Cork.